Good morning. Well, it's good to be back. It's been a very busy few weeks for the youth group. We've had lots going on. We've been traveling all over different places. And, it's funny, in the elder prayer at the beginning, Dave mentioned it's going to be hot. And the youth group's thinking, yeah, that's cute, hot, 91 degrees, sure. Because we've been in Texas, the high schoolers a couple weeks ago, and the middle schoolers this last week. And I wanted to kind of give you guys, before we dig into the sermon here today, I wanted to give you guys a little glimpse of some of the things that our youth group did these past few weeks at camp. Many of you, I know there's a lot of parents in here and relatives and that sort of thing, but beyond that, all the rest of us, part of being a church family, of course, is being connected, being invested in one another in various ways. And so I really wanted to give you guys just a glimpse of a little bit of like what we've been doing and what the youth group's been up to these past few weeks. So first, we took the high schoolers down to a camp called Titus, and it's called Titus because the story in the Old Testament when the 12 spies come back with their report, and Israel is camped at a place called Kadesh Barnea, and it's kind of this moment of, are we going to step out in faith into what God has planned for us, or are we going to retreat back to slavery out of fear? And just kind of on the cusp of that. And that's where a lot of high schoolers are in their faith. And so it's aptly named. And this year's theme at Kadesh it was revolution. And the reason it was called Revolution is because we were studying through the Sermon on the Mount and just the very basic teachings of Jesus and kind of thinking about how revolutionary it is to really put into practice the things Jesus taught us, even the most basic things, like love, how revolutionary that is, how world-changing that is to love like Jesus loved. And so, we did all the different camp things, although we call it camp, but we're really at a university, so they're in dorms. It's not really camp, but we call it camp. There's lots of things going on. There's worship, Bible study, all these different things. But I wanted to give you just a couple of moments from that week to kind of give you a sense of what it was about. So one thing we did midway through the week, having studied the Sermon on the Mount and read through the various things Jesus taught, each student at camp we called them cardboard commitments. There were these squares of cardboard, and what we asked students to do is write on one side just a word or a short phrase that captured some basic thing that Jesus taught. And on the other side, they wrote kind of a commitment based on that, an I will statement, an I will do this because of that. And so each of these high school kids got up on stage and in front of the whole camp showed that commitment to everybody, that's kind of asking a lot of high school students to do that. And I have to say, I was just so impressed by their hearts. Young people, I think, get a lot of criticism in our world today. And don't get me wrong, they are a mess. But I am just so impressed by where their hearts are. And it's so encouraging and hopeful to me for the future when I see where those kids' hearts are. It was really quite moving to see the commitments they made based on their study and discussion of the teachings of Jesus. Later in the week, I want to tell you about one moment in my group. So each of the youth ministers that are there have kind of a group of high schoolers, not necessarily from our own group, but just a random collection of high school students that we're with throughout the week. And this is something that really sets these camps apart. They're just sort of set up a little differently because we have these communities throughout the week that we're with, that we grow really close to, and students feel comfortable sharing from their hearts. And one day during this camp, we were talking about community, and we had read one of the parables of Jesus about the banquet and who's invited and that sort of thing. We had a conversation about how we can welcome others into our faith communities, into our churches, into our youth groups, and just kind of encouraging students to be that welcoming presence. And I had a young lady in my group who was just in tears because she was saying that she just hadn't found that community herself. She had gone to all the churches, all the youth groups in her town, and just hadn't found it. And she was partly weeping because she had found it that week. She told us, I don't have a group like this. I don't have a community like this that I can trust, that I can feel a part of. And I've been praying for her, and I'm going to keep praying for her that she finds that because she needs that community, and there's a community out there that needs her. But I was also, in a way, even though that was a struggle and a sad moment, I was so encouraged that she did find that week. That she, in this little moment of just a week of high school kids getting together, she found a glimpse of the kingdom of God and of a faith community, and how meaningful that is. To just have that moment is so powerful. So that was a couple of weeks ago, and then this last week we took 9 of our middle school girls, 8 middle schoolers and 1 high school volunteer, back to camp. And this week we read through 1 Peter. And there's a couple places in 1 Peter where he talks about living as exiles, or at one point he uses the word aliens, live as aliens in the world. And so that was our theme for the week, aliens in the world. What does that mean? Talked all about that. But really what I want to share with you is one moment before we even got to that, before we even launched camp. We're at the drop-off, and it's funny the differences between the high school camp and the middle school camp at drop-off. You drop the high schoolers off at the dorms, and they're like, all right, see ya, done. The middle school experience is a little bit different because, they're, and I don't mean this, I'm turning now to the youth group here. I don't mean this in a condescending way, so please don't be offended. But a lot of those middle schoolers in their hearts are still just babies. And I mean that in an endearing way, not in a hurtful way. I just mean that there's a part of their hearts that still need mama, right? That they're, in a way, some of these 6th graders are just precious little lambs, right? Just lost. And it's so sweet, but we're dropping them off at the dorms, and there's so much crying going on, and I'm not the one who is like the comfort. So luckily we brought some mamas with us, because I'm not the one they want to hear from in that moment. But some of the ones that had been there before were totally fine, but some of the ones that it was their first time, they were struggling. That's understandable, right? They're far from their family. They maybe haven't been away for that long. They're having a hard time. There's some tears. And I was out messing with the trailer or whatever, so I heard about this later from Heather, but there was this moment. So the kind of motto at these camps that you hear a lot, you see a lot, is you're supposed to be here. You're supposed to be here is something they hear again and again. And so Heather said one of these girls, and again, everybody's crying. There's one of our friends from when we lived in Texas was there. She was having a hard time. She was crying. There was, some of our girls were struggling. Some of the other girls were struggling. And Heather just kind of saw this happen out of the corner of our eyes. Young lady was really struggling, having a hard time, missing mom, not sure what is this place, where am I? And one of these college counselors, this is just a college kid who's just on staff for the summer there at this camp, just didn't hesitate and walked up and scooped this girl up and gave her a big hug and told her, you're supposed to be here. And, I'm not the most, emotionally expressive guy, but when I heard Heather telling me that, I teared up. And the reason I teared up is because I know how powerful community is and belonging is, and what that's meant in my life when I have found community. And so to have our girls there and finding that kind of love and welcome and community, it's moving to me and powerful to me. And I just, some of you think we're crazy for driving that far to camp, but I'll make that drive any day of the week if that's what happens on the other end of it, is these kids find welcome and community and belonging. Because, I don't know how many of us remember what it's like to be in middle school, but it's hard. It's a hard world out there. It's confusing, it's scary, it's painful, it's difficult. And so anytime we can do that for these kids, they are surrounded by a world that's constantly telling them that they're not enough, that they're not good enough, that they're not whatever enough. And and I'm just so thankful for whoever that college kid was that took that moment and said, you're supposed to be here, and showed them welcome and love. What a powerful thing that is. And it's such an encouragement to me. So that's just a little glimpse at where we've been these past couple of weeks. And it's been a great week. They've had, we did all the things, the camp things. There's the bad food and the great energetic worship. So many friendship bracelets made. So many. but lots of fun was had. So, and I want to say thank you just to the church family. You know, we have a youth ministry budget here that's from your contributions, and the bulk of that goes to things like this. In fact, this camp in particular, the bulk of it goes to that, and it's so powerful. And so I want to say thank you for that. And I want to ask you for one more thing. I want to ask you, when you come across one of these kids that went to camp, and it could be today, it could be a month from now, or 3 months from now, I want to ask you a favor. Will you ask them what they learned and ask them what they're going to do about it? Because I heard this years ago. I can't remember who said it to me or who coined this phrase, but it's stayed with me over the years. And that is that we don't actually learn from our experiences. We learn from reflecting on our experiences. And so these kids can go have a great week and have a lot of fun and hear a lot of good things at camp, but if they never think about it again, it doesn't actually mean that much. But if we can remind them, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about what you heard, what you studied, what you learned in those weeks at camp? That could be so powerful. So do me a favor, a month from now, 3 months from now, find one of these kids and ask them, hey, remember what you talked about at camp? What are you going to do about that? How's your life different because of what you read, what you studied, what you learned, what you heard? So let's do that as a church together. You know, Edward has had these statements up on the screen every week of we are a church who, and one of the things, we are a church who loves and wants to root and grow up our children in faith. And so let's support them as they try to learn and grow from what happened last week at camp. If you got your Bibles, turn to Titus chapters 2 and 3. Titus 2 and 3. So we are in a kind of series on leadership. Servant leadership, what does that all look like? What does that mean? And there's lots of good stuff in the book of Titus, in this short letter. I want to focus in a little bit on, so the title here is Leading by Example. We're going to talk about examples this morning. I'm going to give some examples this morning. But focusing mostly on verses 7 and 8. In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. And there in verse 7, you know, he says, set an example. Be an example. Often I've heard Edward say this. Over the years, I've heard lots of people say this phrase, that everyone is a leader. And I remember a long time ago sort of being irritated by that phrase, everyone is a leader. Because I'm thinking, well, not everybody can be a leader. Like, if we're all leading in different directions, there's nobody following. That doesn't work, right? You can't have any organization where everybody thinks they're in charge. But of course, I was missing the point. The point, when people say everyone is a leader, what they mean is that everybody has influence, right? Everything we do, everything we say, even the attitude that we present to the people around us has influence. And so the first point that I take away from chapter 2 here, from verse 7, is to be, you know, you've heard the term influencer. That's like the thing nowadays, is the people on, I don't know, YouTube or TikTok or whatever the latest thing is. And all the young people want to go be an influencer. They think they'll go make a bunch of money and you know, live a great life because they're an influencer on the internet. I don't know about that, but I do know that every one of us has influence, whether we realize it or not. Whether we know it or not, everything you say and do has an impact on somebody around you. And so really, we're already influencers. This is just a question of what kind of influencer am I going to be? Not everybody's in charge. Not everybody's in a position of authority. But in a sense, we are all leaders. We are leading other people in one direction or another. And so I think we should be intentional about that. And maybe that's what Paul had in mind in Titus 2:7 when he says, set an example in everything. Be deliberate about what you say and what you do and how that's impacting others. So you might notice, if you're following along on the handout here, that I've got 5 points from Titus 2 and 3. There's so much more in these chapters. You could easily make 20 points from these chapters, but I picked out 5. And for each of those 5, I wanted to give an example of someone I know, or maybe in some of these it's just a moment, just one moment where I saw this in action. think that's appropriate since we're talking about leading by example to point out some people who've done this. And they're all going to hate it that I'm bringing them up, so I apologize. They'll get over it, though. But so this idea of influence and impact, I want to mention just a scene that played out in the youth group. This was probably 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm sitting in the youth group class. I think it was probably a Wednesday night, again, 2 or 3 years ago. I'm sitting at my spot, my little chair that I teach from at one end of the room. And there's, 7 or 8 people over here to my right. They're laughing. They're having a good time. They're carrying on. Lots of fun being had. And there's one kid over here who's sitting by himself. I honestly don't even remember who it was or what was going on, but it's just a kid sitting by himself. And I remember Phoebe and JC walk into the room. And again, lots of fun being had over here. One kid sitting by himself over here. Neither of them hesitated. They just looked at the room and walked immediately over and sat on either side of the kid sitting by himself. And those were their friends having fun, carrying on over there. But they immediately knew, no, I need to go sit by this person who's by themselves. And man, that was moving to me, impactful to me. And I love thinking about the impact that might have had on everybody else in the room, of just seeing these older girls and how immediately they found a person who wasn't maybe having a great time in that moment and went and encouraged them. That's such a small thing, right? And yet how powerful is that? How much influence and impact can we have by something as simple as greeting someone? Could be in youth group, it could be in the foyer before or after church. All these moments we have where we can just show somebody a little bit of kindness and how much influence that has. That's such a powerful example. And then, so if you keep reading in verse 7, he says, set them an example by doing what is good. And so the next blank in your little handout, it's so great when you're writing a sermon and you just find the perfect, precise word for what you're talking about. So do stuff is what I'm going to say here, as silly and vague as that is. It was funny, at camp, there's all these youth ministers there, and I saw one guy wearing a t-shirt it was some like middle school retreat that they had done, and the logo said, love Jesus and do stuff, which kind of made me chuckle, love Jesus and do stuff, but that really does that kind of captures it, right? Go do stuff. Because if you read this chapter, the vast majority of what he says isn't about something in our heads. It's not something to think. Most of it's not even about what we say. It's about action. It's about doing stuff. Whatever it is, there's always something to be doing. It's about action, not about words. Leading others most of the time is not an intellectual exercise. And this is a challenge for me because I tend to be like an analytical person. I like to think things through. I'm comfortable thinking things through. And so if I'm not careful, I'll sit down with some problem or some situation, and I'll overanalyze it and think through and talk through every aspect of it, and then walk away feeling like I've solved it when I haven't done anything, right? I've just thought about it. And so I so appreciate people who are people of action, who remind me that you got to do stuff. You got to go out there and get busy. I love when, so often when the elders get up at the start of our service, several of them will often say something to our visitors like, if you're looking for a church home, we'd love for you to be here to worship with us. And then often one of them will say something like, we'd love for you to work with us here. Because that's what we do as the people of God, is we get to work. We get busy. We're doing stuff all the time. And I'm so grateful that this church is a church that does that, that's busy. There's so much going on at this place, right? And that's awesome. And so I was thinking about how am I going to give an example of this? Because this is everybody. There's so many people in our church family who are busy just serving, doing so many things. And I was thinking about this. It was immediately obvious to me who I'm going to embarrass here. So sorry, but here it comes. So we're sitting in a meeting a couple months ago, and the various ministry leaders, deacons, elders, etc., ministers, are kind of going around giving an update of what's going on with our areas, right? And I remember somebody was like, okay, I've got this going on. Oh yeah, and Josh Gibbs is going to help us with this event that's going on. It's like, okay, great, cool. Next person comes up and they're talking about, oh yeah, we did this thing last week and Josh helped us with that. And it got to be pretty hilarious because it was like 8 people in a row that were like, yeah, and Josh did this and Josh did that. And then it got to me and I was like, well, we have a youth event, and obviously Josh is helping with that because he's everywhere. He's doing everything. That guy is awesome because he's just doing stuff. He's found stuff to do, and I love the example that sets for all of us, that we can just get busy. We can just do stuff for our church family, for God's kingdom, and how powerful that is, leading others and influencing others by action, by just doing stuff. And then notice what he says at the end of, I think it's the end of verse 8 there. He says, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. So this idea of kind of staying above it, above reproach, is the phrase in another verse. Now, I want to be careful with that because that could be taken in a way that sounds prideful, as if we're like better than everybody else. And I don't think that's at all what Paul is saying here. He's not saying we're going to be better or perfect. It is definitely not like a look down on other people with pride or condescension or anything like that. I think the idea here is criticism is going to happen. Like everybody gets criticized from time to time. But try to live our lives in a way that when those people criticize, they're a little embarrassed because they know it's unjustified. They know they don't have a leg to stand on. He doesn't tell Titus here, Paul doesn't tell Titus to avoid criticism. He doesn't tell him to expect that nobody will criticize. He says, live your life in a way that those critics are going to be ashamed because they don't really have anything bad to say. And I was thinking about this, and one man immediately came to mind. None of you probably know him because he was from far away. He was an elder at the church that I went to in high school. His name was Ralph Martin. And he was known, his name was Ralph Martin, and he lived in Martin City, which is kind of funny. It's just one of the little towns near Kansas City. He was known throughout his whole neighborhood as the Bike Man, or Ralph the Bike Man, or the Martin City Bike Man. He's just kind of always out in his garage repairing bikes. People would come by with some problem. He would fix it up for them, often for free, especially those who couldn't pay. He's just helping them out, making friends. And he was the guy, did you have a guy like this growing up in church who's the guy who always has like candy? You walk in and the kids are like, he's got those, what are those Werthers, little candies? And all the kids just swarm him. He's there to just help out, to be encouraged, to be a friend. I remember he would also, any kid in our church who would memorize the books of the Bible and be able to say them in order, he would buy them a real nice Bible with their name engraved on it. So that was always this big incentive. So he's this faithful guy. He's this really kind guy, presence in the community. And I remember about halfway through high school, there was this really bad church split. Just this, and we don't need to go into the details, but it was just this kind of messy thing where this church got into an argument about something that seemed to me as a high schooler fairly trivial. And then I remember some bitter feelings about that. I remember some hurt, at least for me. I felt hurt by what happened. But then I remember thinking about Ralph and thinking, man, I can't, even though I don't like what happened and I don't fully understand it, again, I was just in high school, didn't know the full story, I couldn't imagine criticizing Ralph. Even though this bad thing had happened, I was like, I know who he is, I know what kind of guy he is, and so I would just be embarrassed to say anything bad about Ralph because he's just such a great guy. And that's what comes to mind when I read this verse, is live a life like that, where, even when things aren't great, even when people want to criticize, they're like, well, I know who you are, so I'm not going to say that, or those who will say it will be ashamed by saying it. So I think of Ralph when I read that verse. And then look down to chapter 3, verse 1. It says, be ready for every good work. Or some translations say, be ready for whatever is good. And that sounds a little bit similar to the second point, but I'm focusing in on this word ready. Do you know people in your life who are just always ready to help out? It's like they're on, think of that feeling when you're jumping in the pool maybe, and you're like leaning forward and you're just ready to jump in. I feel like there's people who just are always on the edge of helping out. They're just right there, and they're seeing whatever it is that needs to be done, and they're just ready. I had this experience actually when we got back from Titus. So I'm exhausted. I'm so tired. My mind is just not functioning fully because I'm so exhausted, and we're carrying bags. And I remember before I could even blink, Dave Schmidt had come up, he had pulled the van over, he had unhooked the trailer and put it away, and it was just like he was just ready. He was just ready to help out. And he's just that kind of guy who's just always ready. By the time I notice, oh, that table needs to be moved or whatever, he's already done it. And that's so encouraging to have people around who are just ready. And I think that's what Paul is telling Titus here, is be someone who's just on the brink, leaning, just ready to help out, always kind of seeing what needs to be done. You know, most of the time, it's not hard to identify what needs to be done. It's not hard to find some good thing to do. And some of you are just gifted in that way that you're always ready. And I want to be more like that. And I think Paul's telling Titus, be like that. Be ready for whatever it is. Just be on the edge, ready to jump in and help out. And then lastly here in verse 9, he says, and it's funny, you know, so we read different translations. Most of you probably, I think, read from the NIV. Because of grad school, I mostly read in the NRSV, because in grad school, seminary, et cetera, there's this emphasis on biblical languages. And so most of the professors want you to be like as literal to the Greek or the Hebrew as possible. And so I tend to read from the NRSV because it's so literal, even though sometimes you lose a little bit of the poetry of it because it's so blunt. But in this case, I really love how blunt the NRSV is. In verse 9, it says, avoid stupid controversies. It's very direct. Avoid the nonsense. Skip that stuff. It's stupid. It's pointless. It's fruitless. I think in the NIV it says something like, you know, avoid fruitless or, unproductive controversies, unprofitable and worthless. We've all witnessed moments when the nonsense gets in the way of leading others, of influencing others. Haven't we all had those moments? Maybe it's moments where we ourselves get caught up in that. And if you look down through church history, it's just full of it. It always just kind of blows my mind that one of the earliest big controversies in the church, one of the biggest fights that Christians had that ended up splitting in a big way a lot of Christians, was what Sunday to celebrate Easter on, which is such a silly, like, who cares, right? It's not that important. And yet that was what they got caught up in. And you look down through church history and it happens again and again and again, where people just get diverted by nonsense. And so I want to give another example of this, and it's, so we've been here 5 years now, my family has, and we've jumped around to a few different life groups in that time, which has been a great way to get to know people a little bit more deeply. This time last year, we were in the Irwin's life group, and I remember we'd be chatting about the lesson or whatever, and I so appreciate Bill, because there'd be times where I or somebody else in the group we'd get going about something that had happened somewhere else. And we'd be talking about, oh, this happened, it was so terrible, it was so bad. And this happened several times where Bill would kind of stop us and he'd get that intense Bill Irwin look in his eyes. And he'd say, hey, you know, that was somewhere else. We're not responsible for that. We're focused on this stuff. We don't need to go into that. And I just so appreciate that little just polite redirection of, hey, we don't need to deal with that. That's not our problem here. And sometimes we all need that, right? We need someone to just remind us to skip the nonsense, skip the unproductive controversies, and focus and get busy, and kind of get to work on what our mission is. And I just love that. And so, you know, as you look down through that list, those are, I think, all things that all of us can do. And I encourage you to go back and read through Titus 2 and 3 on your own, or maybe with your life group. There's so much more in these chapters. And you'll notice how it kind of goes through different roles. Like he speaks to different groups. He says, older men do this. Older women do that. Younger men should do this. And younger women should do that. And he's kind of going through these different things. And he even mentions slaves. And it's a little bit confusing because, in fact, in history, people have misused this text and used texts like this. For example, in the 1800s, there's people who used a text like this to justify slavery and say, here, look, Paul says slaves should obey their masters. But I think that's completely missing the point of what he's saying here. He's not endorsing that. He's not recommending that. What he's saying is wherever you find yourself, old, young, man, woman, slave, or somebody rich or somebody poor, somebody weak or somebody powerful, he's saying wherever God has put you, wherever you find yourself in your life, you can do these things. You can go do good works, be a good influence and a good leader to those around you, whether you are, you know, high up, powerful, whatever, or whether you are the lowest of the low, whether you're old or young, you have so much influence on the people around you. And so I just want to encourage you, wherever you are in your life, you can do these things. I can do these things. We can all do these things. So I'm going to challenge you this week to think about maybe one of these to work on. Do we need to think about how we're going to influence people this week by our words, by our actions, by our attitudes? Do we need to get busy and just find something good to do for our community, for our church family, for God's kingdom? Do we need to think about living holy lives and maybe staying away from stuff that's going to give our critics a leg to stand on? Do we need to have this attitude of readiness, of being on the cusp of doing something so that when something comes along, we're ready to jump in? Or do we need to just remember to kind of sweep aside the extra nonsense stuff that's getting in the way? Whatever it is, I'm going to be praying this week that each one of us kind of becomes a leader and an influencer and does good things. Let's stand and sing.